This content presents World War II historical events for educational purposes only, based on documented records to honor those who served and provide historical insight. This does not glorify violence, promote hatred, or spread misinformation. Viewer discretion advised.
I remember the smell first, cordite mixed with wet earth, and something else, something metallic that coated your throat and never left. Normandy in June 1944 wasn't the liberation we dreamed about back in England. It was hell painted in shades of gray and red. I was just another rifle in the 101st Airborne, another number in a long list of men who jumped into the darkness over France. But what I witnessed in that small village church changed everything I thought I knew about war, about humanity, about the thin line between enemy and brother. The church stood defiant amid the ruins, its spire somehow untouched by the artillery that had turned the rest of the village into rubble. Captain Moore and Lieutenant Wright had commandeered it 3 days into the Housey House fighting. I watched them hang that red cross from the bell tower, a beacon of mercy in an ocean of violence. At first, I thought they were mad. We were surrounded by Germans, trading fire across streets so narrow you could hear them breathing in the buildings opposite. But Moore just looked at me with those steady eyes of his and said, "Son, the Hippocratic Oath doesn't have an asterisk for wartime. The wounded came in waves, carried on stretchers, improvised from doors and shutters, dragged by comrades who'd risk sniper fire to save a friend. I saw men I'd trained with, boys from Iowa and Texas and Brooklyn, their bodies broken by shrapnel and bullets. Wright worked with methodical precision, his hands never shaking even as the walls trembled from nearby explosions. Moore was everywhere at once, triaging, comforting, making impossible decisions about who could be saved and who couldn't. They'd already exhausted the proper medical supplies. Now they were working with field kits, sulfa powder, and morphine syrettes that disappeared faster than rain in desert sand. What happened next? I'll carry to my grave. A German soldier was brought in by 2 of our boys, found bleeding in a cellar. He couldn't have been more than 19, blonde hair matted with blood, calling out for his mother in words we couldn't understand but felt in our bones. I saw the hatred flash across some faces, the instinct to turn away, to let the enemy bleed out on the stone floor. But Moore moved toward him without hesitation, already assessing the wound, already calculating how to save a life that belonged to a man who'd been trying to kill us hours before. The church became something transcendent then, something beyond the war. Moore knelt beside that German boy with the same care he'd shown our own men. Wright prepared instruments with steady hands, unbothered by the uniform on the table. I stood guard at the door, my Thompson submachine gun ready, watching them work under the light of oil lamps and candles. Outside, the battle raged. Inside, 2 American medics fought their own war against death itself, and they didn't discriminate about whose life they were saving. The village of Carentan was supposed to be secured. That's what the brass told us. Anyway, but the Germans had other ideas. They'd left behind snipers, machine gun nests, whole squads holed up in stone houses that had stood for centuries and were about to fall to a rifle fire. Every street corner was a potential death trap, every window a sniper's perch. We'd learned to move in short bursts, using rubble for cover, never staying exposed for more than a heartbeat. But the wounded couldn't move like that. The wounded needed someone to come to them. Ken Moore became a legend those first days. I watched him walk into crossfire with nothing but that red cross painted on his helmet and armband, moving with a purpose that seemed to bend reality around him. Bullets would crack past his head and he'd just keep walking, keep calling out to the wounded, keep dragging men back to that church. Some of the boys started saying he was blessed, that God himself was shielding him. Others said he was just too stubborn to die. I think it was simpler than that. Moore had made a choice about who he was going to be in this war, and nothing, not fear or fire or the very real possibility of death, was going to make him break that promise to himself. Wright was different, but no less courageous. He stayed in the church, turning that sacred space into an operating theater that would have made any field hospital proud. I brought him supplies when I could, scrounging through abandoned aid stations and even German medical kits we'd captured. He'd work for 20 hours straight, his hands stained red to the wrists, his face hollow with exhaustion. But when a wounded man was brought in, his eyes would sharpen and he'd become this instrument of focused healing. I saw him perform surgery with a field knife sterilized in boiling water. I saw him improvise transfusions using volunteers who'd line up to give blood, American and eventually German prisoners, both. The turning point came on the fourth day. A firefight erupted right outside the church, so close we could hear individual voices screaming orders in German and English. Wounded from both sides piled up in the street, and neither army could retrieve them without taking casualties. Moore made a decision that should have gotten him killed. He walked out into that street, hands raised, that red cross on his helmet catching the afternoon light. Both sides stopped firing. Just stopped. For maybe 30 seconds, there was this impossible silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded and Moore's voice calling for help. I was the first one out to help him, then Jackson, then O'Brien. Then even some of the German soldiers emerged from their positions. All of us working together for those 30 seconds that stretched into minutes. We carried wounded into the church without checking uniforms first, without caring about which language they cried out in. Wright met us at the door, directing traffic like he was managing a hospital emergency room. Instead of a medieval church, turned battlefield clinic. When the shooting started again, we were all back behind our lines, but something had shifted. We'd seen each other as something other than targets. We'd been, for just a moment, human beings trying to prevent other human beings from dying in a street far from home. The supplies ran out faster than our prayers could replenish them. By the second week, Wright was rationing morphine like it was liquid gold, saving it for the worst cases. The men whose screams would haunt the church and break the concentration of everyone trying to save lives. I watched him make choices. No man should have to make deciding who got the last of the sulfa powder, who got the precious penicillin we'd received in a supply drop, who would have to endure their pain with nothing but whiskey and a leather strap to bite down on. Moore started venturing further from the church, sometimes disappearing 4 hours into the battle-torn village. He'd come back with German medical supplies, traded for or simply found in abandoned positions. Once, he returned with a German medic he'd found wounded and alone. The man's name was Klaus, and he spoke enough English to communicate. Wright put him to work immediately. There were no politics in that church, new ideologies, just too many wounded and not enough hands to heal them. Klaus worked alongside our medics like he'd always been part of the unit, and the wounded didn't care whose hands saved them as long as they were skilled and gentle. I started keeping a journal during those weeks, scratching words into a notebook I'd taken off a dead German officer. I wrote about the faces I saw in that church, the way suffering erased nationality and made us all the same. An American private from Georgia lay on a pew next to a German corporal from Bavaria. Both got shot, both dying. They couldn't speak each other's language, but they held hands in those final hours. I wrote about that. I wrote about how it broke something inside me and rebuilt it differently. How I could unhate the enemy the same way after I'd watched our medics fight just as hard to save their lives. The local French civilians started helping Madame Bisset, who'd hidden in her cellar through the worst of the fighting, emerged with clean linens, and offered her home as an overflow ward. Her daughter Marie, barely 16, proved to have steady hands and a strong stomach. She assisted Wright with procedures that made seasoned soldiers faint. The church became the center of a network of mercy that spread through the ruins, connecting cellars and shattered homes where the wounded could be hidden and tended. We were still fighting the war, but we'd created this pocket of humanity inside it. Moore told me once, during a brief moment of quiet, that every life saved was a victory against the true enemy, the darkness that war brought out in men's souls. He said that maintaining his humanity in the face of all this death was the hardest battle he'd ever fought, harder than any firefight, harder than the jump into Normandy. But it was a battle he refused to lose, because the moment he stopped seeing the wounded as human beings who deserved his best effort regardless of uniform, that was the moment the war would have truly beaten him. I understood then that these medics weren't just saving bodies, they were saving something essential about what it meant to be human. The breakthrough came in the third week, though breakthrough isn't quite the right word for something that felt more like a collapse into a deeper circle of hell. The Germans launched a counterattack with a ferocity that caught us off. They came at dawn, using the morning fog as cover, hitting our positions with mortar before sending in infantry. The church, which had stood as neutral ground, suddenly found itself on the front line. Shells began landing in the square outside, sending shrapnel singing through the ancient stones. Wright refused to evacuate the wounded. We had maybe 40 men in various states of injury, some who couldn't be moved without killing them. Moore organized us into a defense, positioning those who could still fight at the windows and doorway. I found myself shoulder to shoulder with Klaus, the German medic, both of us firing at the advancing Germans who didn't know or didn't care that one of their own was inside. War creates strange alliances. Klaus shot at his countrymen to protect his patients. I would have done the same. The attack lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of hell compressed into memories that play in my head too fast and too slow at the same time. I remember the moment a mortar shell hit the wall and blew in part of the north side, covering wounded men in dust and stone chips. I remember Wright, thrown to the floor by the blast, getting back up with blood running down his face and going right back to work on a soldier whose leg he'd been amputating. I remember Moore pulling a wounded German lieutenant out of the line of fire, taking a bullet through his shoulder for his trouble, and not even stopping to have it properly dressed before moving to the next crisis. When American reinforcements finally pushed the Germans back, the church looked like something from Dante's Inferno. The Red Cross was torn and bullet. The walls were pocked with shrapnel. Blood covered the floor in pools that reflected the light coming through the new holes in the roof. But everyone inside was still alive. 40 wounded men, including the ones injured in the attack itself, all still breathing because 2 medics and their makeshift staff had refused to abandon them. The commanding officer who arrived to assess the situation couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. American and German wounded, lying side by side, being treated by American medics and a German medic working together. He started to order the German prisoners separated. But Moore, his shoulder hastily bended, stood up and said something I'll never forget. "Sir, in this church there are no Americans and no Germans. There are only patients, and these patients stay where they are until they're stable enough to be moved." The officer looked at the wounded, at Klaus, working to stop a bleed on a kid from Kansas, at the faces of men who'd seen something that transcended orders and regulations. He nodded and walked out without another word. Victory in Normandy came at a price measured in lives and sanity. By the time we finally secured the region and began pushing toward Paris, the church had processed over 300 wounded men. Moore and Wright had worked miracles with nothing but determination and expired morphine. But miracles exact a toll on those who perform them. I watched these two men age years in those weeks, watched their hands develop tremors. They tried to hide, watched their eyes go distant when the screaming started in their dreams. Moore's shoulder wound never properly healed. He refused evacuation, refused to leave his patients, and kept working until infection set in. By the time Wright forced him onto a medical transport to England, he'd developed a fever that almost killed him. I visited him before he left, found him delirious and calling out names of men he'd de-saved and men he'd de-lost in equal measure. His last coherent words to me were an apology for leaving, as if any of us would blame him for finally succumbing to an injury he'd ignored for weeks. Wright stayed with us through the liberation of Paris and into Belgium. But something had broken inside him during those days in the church. He'd made too many impossible choices, held too many dying men, seen too much suffering that he couldn't prevent despite his skills. He started making mistakes, small ones at first, then bigger ones. His hands would shake during procedures. He'd forget steps he'd done 1,000 times. Finally, during the Battle of the Bulge, he had a complete breakdown while trying to save a young soldier who reminded him of his brother. They evacuated him too, sent him to a psychiatric hospital in London where they tried to put his mind back together. Klaus, the German medic, became a prisoner of war, but not before he'd saved dozens more lives alongside us. I heard later that he testified about Moore and Wright at his tribunal, told the story of American medics who'd treated enemy soldiers with the same care as their own. He was released early and went on to become a doctor in Munich. He wrote letters to Moore and Wright for years, thanking them for showing him that humanity could survive even in war's darkest moments. As for me, I carried the memory of that church through the rest of the war and into the peace that followed. I saw terrible things in the months after Normandy, participated in battles that made Carentan look like a skirmish. But I also saw moments of mercy, small acts of compassion between enemies that reminded me of what Moore and Wright had taught us. War doesn't have to strip away everything good in human nature. We can choose, even in the midst of horror, to remain human. The war ended, but the stories didn't. Moore recovered from his infection, but never returned to combat. They made him an instructor, had him teaching new medics about battlefield medicine and the sacred duty of the caregiver. I attended one of his lectures in 1946 after I'd been discharged and was trying to figure out how to be a civilian again. He saw me in the audience and called me up to the front, made me tell the story of the church from a soldier's perspective. His voice was still strong, but his hands still shook sometimes, a permanent reminder of those weeks. Wright never fully recovered. The psychiatric wounds were deeper than anyone realized. He was quietly discharged on a medical pension and returned to his family in Ohio. I tracked him down in 1952, found him working as a pharmacist in a small town, living quietly with his wife and young daughter. We talked for hours that day, sharing memories that no one else would understand. He told me he still had nightmares about the men he couldn't save, still woke up thinking he heard wounded soldiers calling for help. But he also told me that he'd never regretted those days in the church, never regretted choosing mercy over safety. The official records barely mentioned them. Moore received a Silver Star for valor. Wright got a Bronze Star with V. But medals don't capture what they really did, don't explain the magnitude of choosing to save enemy lives when it would have been easier, safer, more acceptable to let them die. They changed everyone who witnessed their work, soldiers and civilians, and even enemy combatants. We scattered across the world after the war, but we carried that lesson with us, that humanity is a choice we make. not a condition imposed by circumstances. I became a teacher after the war, taught history to high school students for 30 years. Every year, when we reached World War II, I would tell them about the church with the Red Cross, about two medics who saw past uniforms to the human beings beneath. Some students got it immediately. Others needed time, needed to mature and face their own moral tests before they understood what Moore and Wright had done. But I planted the seed, kept their memory alive in young minds that would carry it forward into a future they'd never see. The church still stands in Normandy. I visited it in 1974, brought my son to show him where his father had learned what truly mattered in life. The bullet holes had been patched, the damage repaired, but if you knew where to look, you could still see the marks of that battle. The local priest told me that veterans from both sides sometimes visited. Americans and Germans who'd been treated there, who wanted to see again the place where they'd experienced the best of humanity and the worst of circumstances. He called it holy ground. I called it a reminder that we're capable of more than we think, even when everything pushes us toward darkness. I'm old now, older than Moore or Wright ever got to be. They're both gone, passed into whatever comes after this life, and I'm one of the last who remembers the church and what happened there. My grandson asked me recently why I keep telling this story, why I can't let it rest with the men who lived it. I told him it's because some stories are too important to die with those who witnessed them. Some stories need to survive, to remind future generations of what we're capable of when we choose mercy over revenge. The world hasn't learned enough from World War II. We keep fighting wars, keep creating situations where young men and women face the same moral tests Moore and Wright faced. Some pass those tests, many fail, but every person who chooses compassion over cruelty, who sees the humanity in their enemy, who refuses to let war turn them into something less than human, they're continuing the legacy of those two medics in a French church 75 years ago. I think about the men whose lives they saved, both American and German, and the families those men went home to, the children they had, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist because two medics could turn away from suffering even when it wore an enemy uniform. That's hundreds of lives, maybe thousands, if you count all the descendants, all existing because of a choice to heal rather than harm. That's the real victory, more significant than any battle won or territory captured. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Moore and Wright had followed standard procedure, if they'd only treated Americans and let the Germans die. Would the war have ended differently? Probably not. Would I have ended up in the same classroom teaching the same students? Maybe. But I wouldn't have been the same person. None of us who were there would have been. They gave us something precious, proof that we could face the worst that war had to offer and still maintain our humanity, still choose mercy, still see the divine spark in every human being, regardless of the uniform they wore. I'm writing this down now, this final testament, because my time is growing short and I want these words to survive me. I want my grandchildren and their children to know about Captain Ken Moore and Lieutenant Robert Wright, about a German medic named Klaus who chose patience over patriotism, about a church in Normandy that became a sanctuary of human decency in the midst of mechanized slaughter. I want them to know that when they face their own moral tests, whatever form they take, they have a choice. They can choose the easy path of hatred and dehumanization, or they can choose the harder path of seeing the humanity in everyone, even those society labels as enemies. The cross from that church hangs in a military museum now, faded and torn, but still visible. I visited it last year, stood in front of it with tears in my old eyes, remembering those days when it meant the difference between life and death, for so many men. A young soldier, maybe 20 years old, asked me if I was okay. I told him I was better than okay. I was grateful to have witnessed something transcendent, grateful to have known men who showed me what courage really meant, grateful to carry this story forward so that maybe, just maybe, the next generation might learn from it. That's all we can do, really. Tell the story. Remember the lessons. Hope that someone listening will choose mercy when their moment comes. If this story moved you, share it. Tell others about the medics who chose humanity over hatred, who proved that even in war's darkest moments, we can choose to be more than the circumstances demand. Their legacy lives not in medals or monuments, but in the choices we make when tested. When you face your own moral crossroads, remember the church with the red cross and ask yourself, what would Moore and Wright do? That question might just change your life as it changed mine all those years ago in Normandy.